Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if beneath gilded masks and glittering chandeliers, secrets danced as gracefully as the waltz, and truth waited patiently in the shadows of a moonlit ballroom? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. The autumn of 1924 had settled over the English countryside like a velvet blanket. In the grand drawing room of Ashworth Manor, crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the fire, their surfaces dancing with amber reflections. The manor stood like a jewel against the darkening sky, its Georgian windows glowing with warmth and mystery. Lady Cordelia Ashworth moved through her preparations with careful grace. Her fingers, adorned with rings that caught the firelight, adjusted the placement of white roses in crystal vases. The masquerade ball had been planned for months, every detail considered until perfection seemed inevitable. Silk drapes in burgundy and gold hung from tall windows, their fabric breathing with the manor's ancient rhythms. Hundreds of candles created constellations of warm stars throughout the ballroom. The great chandelier sparkled with particular brilliance, casting rainbows across the marble floor below. As twilight deepened, carriages began arriving, their wheels crunching softly on gravel. Guests emerged like exotic birds, each more magnificent than the last. Their masks caught lantern light and threw it back in fragments of colour and shadow. Lady Margaret Fairfax stepped from her carriage wearing a mask of silver and sapphire. Sir Reginald Thornbury arrived with masculine elegance, his black leather mask adorned with gold filigree. Young James Whitmore bounded up the steps enthusiastically, his red silk mask matching his buttonhole carnation. Mrs. Dorothy Henley arrived fashionably late, her emerald mask complementing her velvet gown. Among these glittering figures moved Hercule Poirot, his own mask crafted from deep blue silk. His eyes took in everything with systematic thoroughness, noting how Lady Margaret's fingers trembled slightly, how Sir Reginald's gaze swept the room with military precision. The ballroom was a vision conjured from dreams. The great chandelier cast warm light over polished marble floors that reflected dancers like a still pond reflecting stars. The orchestra filled the air with melodies that wove into the very atmosphere. Couples moved in ancient dance patterns, their masks creating mystery that transformed familiar faces into exotic strangers. Lady Ashworth herself moved through her guests like a gracious spirit, ensuring that wine glasses remained filled and that no guest stood alone for more than a moment. Her mask was a masterpiece of the jeweller's art, crafted from gold and studded with tiny diamonds that caught the light with every movement of her head. Her gown was of midnight blue silk, cut in the latest fashion from Paris, and she wore the confidence of a woman who knew herself to be at the height of her social powers. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew ever more dreamlike. The combination of music, candlelight, and the gentle intoxication of fine wine created a sort of spell over the assembled company. Inhibition softened, conversations became more intimate, and the normal boundaries of social interaction seemed to blur and shift like shadows in the flickering light. It was during a particularly elaborate waltz that Poirot first noticed something amiss. His attention was caught by a figure near the great windows that overlooked the manor's gardens. The person wore a mask of extraordinary craftsmanship, worked in silver and black with details so fine they seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. But it was not the mask that held Poirot's attention, it was the stillness of the figure beneath it. While all around, guests moved and swayed to the music's rhythm, this figure stood motionless as a statue, positioned near the heavy velvet drapes that framed the tall windows. The mask they wore depicted the face of some ancient deity, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge too vast for mortal comprehension. For a moment, Poirot wondered if this might be some elaborate decoration, a mannequin dressed to add to the evening's theatrical atmosphere. But then the figure moved, just slightly, turning their head in a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not trained to observe human behaviour with Poirot's particular intensity. The movement was wrong somehow, lacking the fluid grace that characterised the other guests. It suggested someone fighting against some internal struggle, someone whose composure was maintained through considerable effort. Poirot excused himself from his conversation with Mrs. Henley about the latest fashions from Paris, and began to make his way across the ballroom. He moved with the unhurried precision that was characteristic of all his actions, pausing here and there to exchange pleasantries with other guests, never allowing his true purpose to become obvious to casual observation. The masked figure seemed to sense his approach, though they gave no obvious sign of awareness. As Poirot drew nearer, he could see that the person's hands, visible beneath elegant black gloves, were clenched into fists at their sides. The tension in their posture was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read the language of the human body. "A magnificent evening," Poirot said softly as he came to stand beside the mysterious figure. "Lady Ashworth has outdone herself with the decorations, do you not think?" The figure turned slowly, the movement careful and controlled. Behind the elaborate mask, eyes that might have belonged to anyone in the room regarded Poirot with an expression he could not quite read. When they spoke, their voice was carefully modulated, neither distinctly masculine nor feminine, neither young nor old. "Yes," came the reply, soft as a whisper carried on the evening breeze. "She has created something quite unforgettable." There was something in the way they spoke the last word that sent a small chill down Poirot's spine. It was not so much what was said as how it was said, with a weight of meaning that suggested layers of significance hidden beneath the surface. He was about to respond when the orchestra struck up a new piece, and the mysterious figure melted away into the crowd with the fluid grace of smoke dissipating in the wind. Poirot stood for a moment by the windows, his reflection joining with the darkness beyond the glass. The gardens outside were silver with moonlight, their paths winding between ancient hedges and flower beds that slept beneath the autumn stars. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice adding a note of wildness to the carefully orchestrated elegance within the manor's walls. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when Lady Ashworth approached with the practised smile of a hostess ensuring her guests' comfort. Behind her mask of gold and diamonds, her eyes held the particular satisfaction of someone whose social event was proceeding exactly according to plan. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure, "you seem quite taken with our view tonight. The gardens do look particularly lovely in the moonlight, don't they?" "Indeed, Lady Ashworth," Poirot replied, turning from the window with a small bow, "though I confess I was more intrigued by one of your guests than by the landscaping, however beautiful it might be." "Oh?" Her eyebrows rose with polite curiosity. "And which guest has captured the attention of the famous detective?" Poirot described the figure he had observed, but Lady Ashworth's expression grew puzzled as he spoke. She shook her head slowly, the diamonds in her mask catching the light like tiny stars. "How curious," she murmured. "I know all my guests, naturally, and I cannot think of anyone who fits that description. Perhaps the combination of masks and candlelight has created some confusion. You know how deceptive such lighting can be." Before Poirot could respond, a commotion near the ballroom's entrance drew their attention. A latecomer had arrived, and from the stir they were causing among the other guests, it was clearly someone of considerable importance. The crowd parted to reveal a figure in an extraordinarily elaborate costume, their mask a work of art that must have taken months to create. "Ah," Lady Ashworth breathed, relief and pleasure mingling in her voice. "That will be Lord Pemberton. I was beginning to worry he might not attend, but he's clearly made the effort worthwhile. That mask is absolutely magnificent." The newcomer moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the centre of attention. Their costume was a perfect recreation of Venetian nobility from centuries past, complete with a cloak that seemed to flow around them like liquid shadow. The mask they wore was a masterpiece of the craftsman's art, worked in gold and precious stones with such skill that it seemed almost alive in the flickering candlelight, As Lord Pemberton made his way around the room, greeting friends and accepting compliments on his costume, Poirot found his attention drawn once again to the mysterious figure by the windows. But when he looked, the space was empty, the heavy curtains stirring slightly in a draught that might have been caused by someone passing close behind them. The evening continued to unfold with all the gracious rituals of a perfect social gathering. The orchestra played piece after piece, their music weaving a spell of elegance over the assembled company. Couples danced, glasses were refilled, and conversations flowed with the ease of old friends and the careful politeness of new acquaintances. The great chandelier cast its warm light over marble floors that reflected the swirling colours of silk gowns and the glitter of jewellery like a captured constellation. It was approaching midnight when the first scream shattered the evening's elegant tranquillity. The sound cut through the music and conversation like a blade, stopping dancers in mid-step and turning every masked face toward its source. For a moment, the ballroom fell into a silence so complete that the crackling of candle flames could be heard clearly in the sudden stillness. The scream had come from the library, a room adjacent to the ballroom where some guests had retreated for quieter conversation, away from the music and dancing. Lady Ashworth was the first to move, her training as a hostess overcoming her shock as she hurried toward the source of the disturbance. Poirot followed close behind, his mind already beginning to organise itself for whatever crisis awaited. They found Mrs. Dorothy Henley standing in the centre of the library, her emerald mask askew and her face pale with shock. Her gloved hands pressed against her mouth as if trying to hold back further cries, and her eyes were fixed on something near the great fireplace that dominated the room's far wall. Lord Pemberton lay motionless on the Persian carpet before the hearth, his magnificent costume spread around him like the wings of some exotic bird. His elaborate mask had fallen to one side, revealing features that were peaceful in death, as if he had simply chosen to lie down for a rest among the leather-bound books and comfortable chairs. But the small pool of crimson that was slowly spreading beneath his body told a different story entirely. Lady Ashworth's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the suddenly oppressive silence. Her hands, still elegant despite their trembling, reached out as if to somehow undo what had been done, to restore order to a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. The fire crackled in the grate, its warm light playing over the scene with grotesque cheerfulness, as if it had not yet realised that celebration had turned to tragedy. "Nobody must touch anything," Poirot said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence with gentle authority. "Mrs. Henley, please step away from Lord Pemberton. We must preserve the scene exactly as it is." The small group that had gathered in the library doorway, Sir Reginald, young Whitmore, Lady Margaret, and several other guests whose names Poirot had not yet learned, stood frozen like actors in a tableau. Their masked faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to fear to a kind of horrible fascination that seemed almost indecent in its intensity. "Should we not call for a doctor?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps there is still?" "I am afraid not, madame," Poirot replied gently. "Lord Pemberton is beyond earthly help now, but we must call for the police immediately, and until they arrive we must ensure that nothing is disturbed." As if his words had broken some kind of spell, the group began to stir back to life. Sir Reginald took charge with the automatic authority of his military background, dispatching footmen to telephone the authorities and to inform the remaining guests that the evening had come to an abrupt and tragic end. Lady Ashworth sank into one of the library's leather chairs, the gold and diamonds of her mask seeming suddenly tawdry in the presence of death. Young Whitmore stood near the doorway, his red silk mask pushed up onto his forehead, revealing a face that had aged years in the space of minutes. His earlier enthusiasm had evaporated entirely, replaced by the hollow-eyed shock of someone confronting mortality for perhaps the first time in his privileged life. It was then that Poirot noticed something that made him step close to the body, careful not to disturb the scene but positioning himself where he could observe more clearly. Lord Pemberton's right hand, which had fallen open in death, contained a small piece of paper. The firelight caught its edge, making it visible against the dark carpet where it might otherwise have been missed entirely. "Lady Ashworth," Poirot said softly. Was Lord Pemberton in the habit of carrying notes or papers with him at social events? She looked up from her chair, her mask still slightly askew, giving her face a lopsided appearance that would have been comical in other circumstances. "Notes? No, I don't believe. That is to say, he was not a businessman, Mr. Poirot. He had no need to carry documents to a masquerade ball." "Then perhaps," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to the others, this was not something he brought with him, but rather something that was brought to him. The piece of paper was small, about the size that might be torn from the corner of a larger sheet. From his position, Poirot could see that it contained writing, though the flickering firelight made it impossible to read the words clearly. The handwriting appeared to be in a careful script, neither hurried nor careless, suggesting someone who had taken time to compose their message with deliberation. "Has anyone seen the person I described earlier?" Poirot asked, turning to address the small group of witnesses. The figure in the silver and black mask standing near the ballroom windows. The assembled guests looked at each other with the particular confusion of people, trying to recall specific details from what had been, until a few moments ago, simply a pleasant social evening. Masks and candlelight had created an atmosphere where individual identification was both part of the evening's charm and its fundamental challenge. "There were so many magnificent costumes," Lady Margaret said hesitantly. "And the masks, you understand. It was rather the point that we shouldn't be able to identify each other too easily." Sir Reginald nodded agreement, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances. "Quite right. Half the entertainment was in guessing who was behind each mask. Can't say I took particular notice of any one costume." Young Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his gaze moving restlessly around the room as if looking for something, or someone who was no longer there. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd note, somewhere between confusion and something that might have been fear. "I thought I saw someone leaving the ballroom just before Mrs. Henley screamed," he said slowly. "Someone moving quite quickly toward the main staircase, but with all the masks and costumes I couldn't say who it might have been." "Moving quickly, you say?" Poirot's attention sharpened. "As if they were in a hurry? Or perhaps as if they were fleeing?" The young man's face flushed beneath his pushed-back mask. I couldn't say, really. It was just an impression. Someone moving with more purpose than the usual social circulation, if you understand my meaning." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of the local constabulary, their timing impeccable in that peculiarly English way that suggested they had been hovering just close enough to respond quickly, but not so close as to seem presumptuous. Inspector Davies of the county police was a man of middle years and careful disposition, the sort of official who approached unusual situations with methodical thoroughness rather than dramatic flair. "Lady Ashworth," he said as he removed his hat in the library doorway, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. "I came as quickly as possible. This is indeed a grave situation." As the inspector began his preliminary examination of the scene, Poirot found himself studying the assembled guests with renewed attention. The shock of discovery was beginning to wear off, replaced by the complex mix of emotions that always followed unexpected death. Fear, certainly, as the reality of murder, for murder it clearly was, settled over the group like a cold fog. But there were other currents as well: curiosity, calculation, and in at least one case something that looked very much like relief. The mysterious figure he had observed earlier seemed to have vanished entirely, as if there had been nothing more than a trick of candlelight and imagination. But Poirot's trained observation told him otherwise. Someone had been there, someone whose presence had been carefully planned and whose departure had been timed with precision. The question was whether that someone was among the guests who remained, hidden now behind a different mask or a different manner, or whether they had indeed fled into the autumn night as young Whitmore suggested. Inspector Davies completed his initial examination with the methodical care of a man who understood that first impressions were often the most important. He studied the small piece of paper in Lord Pemberton's hand without removing it, making notes in a leather-bound notebook that looked as though it had seen considerable use in similar circumstances. The weapon appears to have been a thin blade, he announced to the assembled company. Something like a letter opener or a small dagger. The wound is quite precise, suggesting either considerable skill or remarkable luck on the part of the perpetrator. He paused in his examination to look up at the waiting guests, his eyes moving from face to face with the careful attention of someone trained to read human nature under stress. The masks that had provided such delightful anonymity earlier in the evening now seemed sinister, hiding expressions that might have provided valuable clues to the inspector's investigation. "I'm afraid I must ask all of you to remain available for questioning," he continued. "This is clearly a case of murder, and until we have determined exactly what transpired here tonight, no one who was present at the ball can be considered above suspicion." A collective intake of breath greeted this announcement, though whether it was shock at being considered suspects or merely the natural human response to having one's freedoms suddenly constrained was impossible to determine. Lady Ashworth rose from her chair with the dignity of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under trying circumstances. "Of course, Inspector," she said, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "My staff will prepare rooms for any guests who require accommodation tonight, and we shall all cooperate fully with your investigation." As the inspector continued his work, Poirot positioned himself where he could observe both the crime scene and the remaining guests. His attention was particularly drawn to the way each person reacted to the inspector's methodical questions and observations. Years of experience had taught him that human nature revealed itself most clearly under stress, and the combination of sudden death and official scrutiny was creating exactly the kind of pressure that sometimes caused carefully maintained facades to crack. Mrs. Henley had recovered somewhat from her initial shock, and was now displaying the kind of nervous energy that often followed traumatic discoveries. She moved restlessly around the room, her emerald silk gown rustling with each step, her hands adjusting and readjusting her mask and gloves with the unconscious repetition of someone whose nerves were stretched to their limits. Sir Reginald maintained his military bearing, but Poirot noticed that his hands, clasped behind his back in a posture of attention, were clenched into fists. The tension in his shoulders suggested someone fighting to maintain control over emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully cultivated reserve. Lady Margaret had grown very quiet, her fan moving slowly back and forth in a rhythm that seemed disconnected from the temperature of the room. Behind her silver and sapphire mask, her eyes darted frequently toward the doorway, as if calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Young Whitmore stood apart from the others, his earlier gregarious nature completely subdued. The confident smile that had characterized his demeanor throughout the evening had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of confusion and growing anxiety that aged his youthful features considerably. It was then that Inspector Davies made his next significant discovery. As he carefully examined the area around Lord Pemberton's body, his attention was caught by something partially hidden beneath one of the heavy library chairs. Moving with careful precision, he retrieved what appeared to be a mask. Not just any mask, but one that matched exactly Poirot's earlier description of the mysterious figure by the ballroom windows. The mask was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, worked in silver and black with details so fine they seemed to shift and change, even in the steady light of the library's lamps. The face it depicted was that of some ancient deity, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, with empty eye holes that seemed to hold depths of shadow too dark for mortal comprehension. "Has anyone seen this mask before tonight?" Inspector Davies asked, holding it up for the assembled guests to examine. The responses were immediate and uniform, shaking heads and murmured denials from everyone present. Lady Ashworth studied it with particular attention, her brow furrowed with concentration beneath her gold and diamond mask. "I can say with absolute certainty that this mask was not among those I arranged for this evening," she declared. "I personally approved every costume and accessory, and I would have remembered something so distinctive." Poirot stepped forward to examine the mask more closely, though he was careful not to disturb the inspector's work. The craftsmanship was indeed extraordinary, but there was something else about it that caught his attention, a faint scent that clung to the silk lining inside the mask. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakably present. The delicate fragrance of jasmine mixed with something else, something medicinal that he could not immediately identify. "Inspector," he said quietly, "if I may suggest, this mask should be examined very carefully for any traces that might identify its wearer. The inside, particularly, may hold valuable evidence." Davies nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Mr. Poirot. In cases like this, the smallest details often prove most significant." He carefully wrapped the mask in a clean cloth before placing it in his evidence bag. "Now then, I believe it's time we heard from each of you exactly what you observed this evening." The questioning that followed was methodical and thorough, with each witness providing their account of the evening's events in turn. The stories that emerged painted a picture of a social gathering that had proceeded according to all the expected conventions until its tragic conclusion. Everyone had noticed Lord Pemberton's arrival, his magnificent costume making him impossible to miss. Most remembered seeing him circulating through the ballroom, engaging in the sort of light social conversation that was expected at such events. But when it came to the crucial period just before the murder was discovered, the accounts became frustratingly vague. The combination of masks, costumes and candlelight had created an atmosphere where precise identification was nearly impossible, which was, of course, exactly what had been intended for the evening's entertainment. Mrs. Henley's account was perhaps the most detailed, though it focused primarily on her discovery of the body rather than any observations that might have preceded it. She had retreated to the library, she explained, seeking a few moments of quiet away from the music and dancing. The room had appeared empty when she entered, but as she moved toward the fireplace to warm herself, she had noticed what she initially took to be someone who had perhaps overindulged in Lady Ashworth's excellent champagne and chosen to rest on the comfortable carpet. "It wasn't until I came closer that I realised," she trailed off, her voice catching slightly, "that I realised Lord Pemberton was not merely resting. Sir Reginald's military training had made him particularly observant of crowd movements and potential security concerns, but even his practised eye had not detected anything obviously suspicious during the evening. He had noticed the same general circulation of guests that everyone else described, with people moving between the ballroom, the adjoining salon, and the library in the fluid patterns typical of such gatherings. If there was anything unusual, he said thoughtfully, it was perhaps that Lord Pemberton seemed somewhat distracted during our brief conversation. Not his usual jovial self, you might say. But then, one never knows what concerns might be weighing on a man's mind. Young Whitmore's account was notable for its nervousness, his words tumbling over each other in a rush to provide as much information as possible. He had indeed seen someone moving with apparent purpose toward the main staircase just before Mrs. Henley's scream, but the more he tried to recall specific details, the more uncertain he became about what he had actually observed. "The thing is," he said, running a hand through his hair in agitation, "everyone was moving about all evening. It's the nature of such gatherings, isn't it? People circulate, they step out for air, they visit other rooms. At the time, it didn't seem particularly significant. Lady Margaret's testimony was characterised by the precise observation skills of someone who had spent years navigating complex social situations. She had noticed several brief conversations between Lord Pemberton and other guests, but nothing that had struck her as unusual or concerning at the time. He seemed to be enjoying himself," she said carefully. "Perhaps not quite as exuberantly as usual, but certainly in good spirits. If something was troubling him, he concealed it very well." As the individual accounts were completed, Inspector Davies began to piece together a timeline of the evening's events. Lord Pemberton had arrived fashionably late, around 10:30, and had spent approximately an hour and a half circulating among the other guests, before meeting his death in the library. The murder itself had occurred sometime between midnight and 12:15, based on Mrs. Henley's discovery and the estimated time of death. "What troubles me," the inspector confided to Poirot as they stood together near the library's tall windows, "is the complete absence of obvious motive. Lord Pemberton was well liked, financially secure, and had no known enemies. Why would anyone want to kill him?" Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving between the crime scene and the small group of witnesses who remained clustered near the doorway. "Perhaps, Inspector, the answer lies not in who Lord Pemberton was, but in what he might have known. That small piece of paper in his hand, It suggests that he may have been lured to the library by someone who wished to communicate with him privately. The inspector's examination of the note had revealed tantalizing but incomplete information. The paper appeared to have been torn from a larger sheet, and the writing upon it was brief and cryptic. "Meet me in the library at midnight. I have something you need to know about C.A." "C.A.?" Inspector Davies mused. "Could refer to any number of people or things. Cordelia Ashworth, perhaps, given that she's our hostess." Lady Ashworth's reaction to this suggestion was immediate and emphatic. "I can assure you, Inspector, that I had no private communication planned with Lord Pemberton. Indeed, beyond the normal pleasantries expected between hostess and guest, we had very little interaction this evening." But Poirot had noticed something else about the note that the inspector had not yet commented upon. The handwriting, while careful and deliberate, showed certain characteristics that suggested the writer had been under some degree of emotional stress. The letters, though formed correctly, varied slightly in size and spacing in ways that indicated someone fighting to maintain composure while writing. "If I may suggest, Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "it might be valuable to obtain samples of handwriting from all the guests present tonight. A comparison might reveal who penned that note." The suggestion was logical and practical, but it produced an immediate and uncomfortable reaction from the assembled witnesses. The idea of being asked to provide handwriting samples transformed them, in their own minds, from unfortunate witnesses to active suspects, and the psychological impact was visible in their changed postures and expressions. Mrs. Henley's hands fluttered to her throat, adjusting and readjusting the clasp of her emerald necklace with nervous energy. "Surely you don't suspect that one of us, that someone among Lady Ashworth's guests, could be capable of such a horrible act?" Sir Reginald's military bearing stiffened even further, if such a thing were possible. "I must protest, Inspector. The suggestion that someone of our social standing might be involved in common murder is quite extraordinary." But it was young Whitmore's reaction that Poirot found most interesting. The young man had gone very pale, and his hands, which had been fidgeting with his mask throughout the evening, were now clasped tightly together as if to prevent them from shaking. "Of course," Whitmore said, his voice higher than usual. "We all want to help with the investigation. It's just rather shocking to think that someone we know might be involved." Lady Margaret had remained silent during this exchange, but Poirot noticed that she had moved closer to the library's fireplace, her silver and sapphire mask catching the warm light in ways that created shifting patterns of shadow across her features. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and careful. "Inspector Davies," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "while we all wish to assist your investigation, I think it important to consider that the guilty party may not be among those of us who remained. As young Mr. Whitmore observed, someone was seen leaving the ballroom around the time of the incident. Perhaps your efforts would be better directed toward identifying that person." It was a reasonable suggestion, but something in the way she delivered it caught Poirot's attention. There was a subtle emphasis on certain words, a careful construction of the sentence that suggested someone with considerable experience in choosing words that would lead listeners towards specific conclusions while maintaining perfect plausibility. Inspector Davies nodded thoughtfully. "A valid point, Lady Margaret. However, proper investigative procedure requires that we thoroughly examine all possibilities before drawing conclusions. The handwriting samples will help us either eliminate the present company from suspicion or identify important leads to pursue. Earlier this evening," she began, her words chosen with careful precision, "Lord Pemberton approached me during the dancing. He seemed distressed about something. He asked if we might speak privately, away from the other guests. When I asked what the matter was, he said it concerned something he had discovered about my late husband's business dealings." She paused, her gaze moving around the room to take in each of the assembled witnesses. "My husband, as some of you know, passed away 2 years ago. His affairs were complicated. There were certain business partnerships and investments that I preferred to keep private, not because they were improper, but because they involved people who valued their discretion. And Lord Pemberton had somehow discovered information about these business matters," Inspector Davies prompted gently. "So it appeared," Lady Ashworth continued. "He seemed to believe that he had uncovered something that might prove embarrassing or damaging if it became public knowledge. He suggested that we discuss the matter after the other guests had departed. but I felt it would be better to address his concerns immediately rather than allow them to fester. So you wrote the note asking him to meet you in the library at midnight? Yes, her voice was steady, but Poirot noticed that her hands had begun to tremble slightly. I wanted to explain that whatever he thought he had discovered, it was likely either inaccurate or misunderstood. My husband's business dealings, while complex, were entirely legitimate. But you did not meet him in the library as arranged? Inspector Davies continued. Lady Ashworth shook her head. Number. Just before midnight I was called away by an urgent matter in the kitchens. One of the serving girls had suffered a minor accident, and as hostess I felt obligated to ensure she received proper care. By the time I was free to meet Lord Pemberton, Mrs. Henley had already... She gestured toward the fireplace where Lord Pemberton's body had been found. Young Whitmore suddenly stepped forward, his face flushed with agitation. "But that's not possible," he exclaimed, his voice cracking slightly. "I saw you in the ballroom just before Mrs. Henley screamed. You were speaking with the Countess of Wetherby near the orchestra." All eyes turned to him, and Poirot noticed that his outburst had caught him by surprise as much as anyone else. He stood frozen for a moment, apparently realising that his observation contradicted Lady Ashworth's account in ways that could prove very significant to the investigation. "That is to say," Whitmore continued more hesitantly, "I believe I saw you there. With all the masks and costumes, perhaps I was mistaken." But Inspector Davies was already consulting his notes from earlier conversations. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, according to your previous statement, you observed someone moving quickly toward the main staircase, just before the body was discovered. Are you now saying you also saw Lady Ashworth in the ballroom at approximately the same time?" The young man's face grew even redder. That is, there were so many people, and the lighting..." He trailed off, apparently realising that his attempts at clarification were only making the situation more confusing. Lady Margaret had been watching this exchange with growing interest, her silver and sapphire mask pushed up onto her forehead to reveal sharp, intelligent eyes that missed very little. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through social confusion to reach essential truths. "Inspector Davies," she said calmly, "it occurs to me that we may be approaching this investigation from the wrong direction entirely. We have been assuming that Lord Pemberton was the intended victim, but what if that assumption is incorrect?" The suggestion created an immediate stir among the assembled guests. Poirot felt his own interest sharpen considerably. It was an observation that demonstrated the kind of lateral thinking that often proved crucial in complex investigations. "Please elaborate, Lady Margaret," Inspector Davies said, his pen poised over his notebook. "Consider the circumstances," she continued, warming to her theme. "Lord Pemberton arrived late, and in an elaborate costume that made him instantly recognisable. He spent the evening circulating among guests, most of whom he knew well. If someone had wanted to harm him specifically, they would have had numerous opportunities to approach him openly, perhaps even to lure him to a private location without the need for mysterious notes. As arrangements were made for the handwriting samples, Poirot found himself studying the dynamics among the remaining guests with renewed interest. The shock of Lord Pemberton's death was beginning to give way to more complex emotions and calculations. Fear, certainly, as the reality of being involved in a murder investigation settled over them. But there were subtler currents as well. Alliances forming and dissolving, glances exchanged that carried meanings beyond the obvious, the kind of intricate social manoeuvring that was as natural as breathing among people of their class and background. Mrs. Henley had positioned herself near Sir Reginald, seeking perhaps the comfort of his military authority and masculine protection. Her earlier nervousness had evolved into something more purposeful, and Poirot noticed that she seemed to be studying each of the other guests with a new intensity, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Young Whitmore had grown increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He moved restlessly around the room, never staying in one position for more than a few moments, his eyes darting between the other guests and the doorway as if calculating escape routes. Lady Ashworth maintained her composure with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to handling social crises, but Poirot could see the strain beginning to show around the edges. Her hands, usually so graceful and controlled, had developed a slight tremor, and her voice, while still pleasant, carried an underlying tension that spoke of considerable emotional pressure. The handwriting samples, when collected, provided some interesting revelations. Each guest was asked to copy the same brief passage from one of the library's books, providing Inspector Davies with specimens that could be compared to the mysterious note found in Lord Pemberton's hand. Mrs. Henley's handwriting was flowing and feminine, with elaborate flourishes that spoke of expensive education and considerable practice in social correspondence. Sir Reginald's script was precise and military in its uniformity, each letter formed with the mechanical regularity of someone trained to prioritise clarity over artistry. Lady Margaret wrote with the confident strokes of someone accustomed to signing important documents and correspondence, her letters large and bold without being ostentatious. Young Whitmore's sample was perhaps the most revealing. His handwriting showed clear signs of nervousness, slight tremors in the strokes, variations in letter size that suggested an unsteady hand, and several false starts where he had begun letters and then corrected them. Most significantly, his natural writing style bore certain similarities to the mysterious note, particularly in the formation of specific letters and the general spacing between words. But it was Lady Ashworth's sample that provided the most dramatic revelation. As she completed her copying of the passage, Inspector Davies compared it immediately to the note from the crime scene. The similarity was unmistakable, not just in the general characteristics of the handwriting, but in specific details that would be nearly impossible to forge convincingly. "Lady Ashworth," Inspector Davies said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I'm afraid I must ask you to explain how your handwriting came to appear on a note apparently used to lure Lord Pemberton to his death." The silence that followed this announcement was profound and uncomfortable. Lady Ashworth stood motionless by the library fireplace, her gold and diamond mask catching the light in patterns that seemed to fracture and scatter with each shallow breath. For a long moment the only sounds were the soft crackling of the fire and the distant ticking of the great clock in the hallway. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the expectant silence it carried clearly to every corner of the room. "I did write that note," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. "But I did not kill Lord Pemberton." Inspector Davies leaned forward slightly, his notebook ready. "Please explain the circumstances under which you wrote the note, Lady Ashworth." She removed her mask with slow, deliberate movements, revealing a face that was pale but composed. Without the elaborate disguise, she looked older than she had earlier in the evening, but also somehow more dignified, as if the revelation had stripped away the pretense to reveal someone capable of facing difficult truths directly. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. But what if the murderer's target was not Lord Pemberton, but someone else entirely? What if Lord Pemberton was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps having arrived at the library for his appointment with Lady Ashworth, only to encounter someone who was lying in wait for a different victim? The theory was both plausible and disturbing, opening up entirely new avenues of investigation, while simultaneously making the case far more complex. If Lord Pemberton had not been the intended target, then everyone's movements and motives required complete re-examination. Poirot found himself nodding slowly as he considered the implications. "It is indeed possible, Lady Margaret, but if Lord Pemberton was not the intended victim, then who was? And why did the murderer not simply flee when they realised their mistake?" "Perhaps," Sir Reginald interjected, his military mind engaging with the tactical aspects of the problem, "they had no choice but to proceed. If Lord Pemberton had seen something or someone that could have identified the perpetrator, they may have felt compelled to silence him to protect themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of additional police personnel, including a sergeant and a constable, who had been conducting a search of the manor grounds. Their report added another layer of complexity to an already puzzling situation. "Inspector," the sergeant reported, "we found evidence of someone having left the manor through the garden doors that open onto the east terrace. The gravel there shows clear footprints leading away from the house toward the old carriage path that runs along the estate's eastern boundary." "Fresh prints?" Davies inquired. "Very recent, sir. Made within the last few hours, I'd say. The interesting thing is that they appear to have been made by someone wearing evening shoes. not the sort of footwear you'd typically choose for walking across rough ground in the dark. This discovery seemed to support the theory that someone had indeed fled the manor after committing the murder, but it also raised new questions. If the murderer had escaped, why had they chosen such a difficult and conspicuous route? The east terrace was visible from several windows of the manor, and the old carriage path, while providing eventual access to the main road, was overgrown and treacherous in darkness. Mrs. Henley had been growing increasingly agitated as the investigation progressed, and this new development seemed to push her past some internal threshold of tolerance. "Inspector Davies," she said, her voice rising with each word, "surely this proves that the guilty party has escaped. Why are we continuing to treat Lady Ashworth's guests as suspects when there is clear evidence that someone has fled?" But Poirot had been studying the dynamics of the group with increasing interest, and Mrs. Henley's emotional outbreak struck him as somehow disproportionate to the circumstances. Her nervousness had been consistent throughout the evening, but there was something else underlying it now, something that suggested personal involvement rather than mere shock at witnessing tragedy. "Mrs. Henley," he said gently, "you discovered Lord Pemberton's body in the library. Can you describe exactly what you observed when you first entered the room?" She turned toward him with obvious reluctance, her emerald mask trembling in her hands. I told you already. I came in to rest for a moment, away from the music and dancing. The room appeared empty at first." "At first, yes. But then I saw Lord Pemberton lying by the fireplace. I thought initially that he might have been taken ill, or perhaps had too much to drink. It wasn't until I came closer—" She shuddered, the memory clearly distressing. "And you touched nothing? Disturbed nothing before calling for help?" "Of course not." The vehemence of her response was immediate and perhaps too strong. "That is, I may have— One naturally reaches out when one sees someone who appears to need assistance." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "Naturally. It would be the normal human response to want to help. But if you did touch anything, Mrs. Henley, it would be important for the investigation to know exactly what." She was silent for several long moments, her hands working nervously at the fabric of her gown. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I may have touched his wrist," she whispered, "to check for a pulse, and perhaps I moved the paper in his hand slightly, trying to see if it contained some explanation for what had happened." Inspector Davies looked up sharply from his notes. "You handled the paper? The note we found in Lord Pemberton's hand?" "Only briefly," Mrs. Henley's voice rose in pitch. "Only to see if it might tell us what had happened. When I saw the blood, I dropped it immediately." This revelation cast everything in a new light. If Mrs. Henley had handled the note, her fingerprints would be on it along with those of whoever had originally written and delivered it. More importantly, it raised questions about what else she might have observed or done during those crucial moments before she raised the alarm. But there was something else troubling Poirot about Mrs. Henley's account, something that went beyond the issue of the handled evidence. Her description of entering the library and finding it apparently empty was inconsistent with the crime scene as he understood it. Lord Pemberton's body lay in a position that should have been visible immediately upon entering the room, not something that would require approaching the fireplace to discover. "Mrs. Henley," he said carefully, "when you say the room appeared empty at first, do you mean that you did not see Lord Pemberton's body immediately upon entering?" Her face went very pale. The lighting in the room was quite dim, and I was not expecting. That is, one does not enter a room looking for— But the fireplace provides considerable illumination," Poirot continued gently, "and Lord Pemberton's costume was quite distinctive. Are you certain you did not see him immediately?" The silence that followed this question stretched uncomfortably long. Mrs. Henley's hands had begun to shake visibly, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she were afraid that hesitation would rob her of the courage to speak at all. "Very well," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Lord Pemberton was not alone when I entered the library." The effect of this admission on the assembled company was electric. Inspector Davies's pen froze over his notebook, and every face in the room turned toward Mrs. Henley with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. "Please continue, Mrs. Henley," the inspector said quietly. "There was someone else in the room," she said. the words tumbling out now as if a dam had burst. Someone in a dark cloak kneeling beside Lord Pemberton's body. When they heard me enter, they stood quickly and moved toward the window. Can you describe this person more specifically? It was difficult to see clearly in the firelight. Average height perhaps, wearing a long dark cloak with a hood that concealed their features. They moved, gracefully, quietly, like someone accustomed to moving without being noticed. And what happened then? They went to the window, the tall one that opens onto the east terrace, and climbed through. I heard their footsteps on the gravel outside moving quickly away from the house. Inspector Davies made rapid notes, his earlier theory about someone escaping through the garden doors now taking on much more significance. But Poirot was puzzled by other aspects of Mrs. Henley's revised account. This person who was kneeling beside Lord Pemberton, he said thoughtfully, did they appear to be searching for something? Or perhaps administering some form of aid? Mrs. Henley's brow furrowed as she tried to recall details from what had clearly been a traumatic and confusing moment. I'm not certain. They were very still when I first saw them, as if they were listening for something, or perhaps examining something about the body. And they said nothing to you before fleeing? Nothing at all. The moment they realised I was there, they moved immediately toward the window. It was as if they had been waiting for an opportunity to escape, and my arrival provided the distraction they needed. This account created as many new questions as it answered. If the cloaked figure had been the murderer, why had they remained in the library after committing their crime? If they had been trying to help Lord Pemberton, why had they fled rather than calling for assistance? And most puzzling of all, why had Mrs. Henley initially concealed their presence? Mrs. Henley, Inspector Davies said, his voice carrying a note of official authority. Why did you not mention this other person in your initial account of discovering the body? She looked around the room with the desperate air of someone seeking support that was not forthcoming. I was frightened, confused. I had just witnessed something horrible and I wasn't thinking clearly. I suppose I hoped that if I simply reported finding Lord Pemberton's body, the authorities would be able to determine what had happened without my having to become more involved. It was a human reaction, understandable if not particularly helpful to the investigation. But Poirot sensed there might be more to her reluctance than simple shock and confusion. Her behaviour throughout the evening had suggested someone operating under considerable emotional strain, and her delayed revelation about the mysterious cloaked figure felt less like recovered memory than like a carefully calculated decision to reveal information that she had hoped to keep hidden. Young Whitmore, who had been silent during Mrs. Henley's revelation, suddenly stepped forward with obvious agitation. "Mrs. Henley," he said, his voice tight with some emotion Poirot could not immediately identify. "Are you absolutely certain about what you observed? About this cloaked figure?" The question seemed oddly urgent, and it produced an immediate reaction from Mrs. Henley. Her face flushed, and she looked at Whitmore with an expression that might have been anger or fear or perhaps both. "Of course I'm certain," she snapped. "Do you think I would fabricate such a thing? Do you think I would lie about witnessing a murder?" No, of course not," Whitmore backpedaled quickly. "I simply meant that in traumatic situations, memory can sometimes play tricks, and I wondered if perhaps the lighting or the shock might have caused you to misinterpret what you saw." But his explanation rang hollow, and Poirot noticed that Lady Margaret was watching this exchange with sharp interest. There were undercurrents here that went beyond the obvious, relationships and tensions among the guests that predated the evening's tragic events. Sir Reginald, ever practical in his military way, raised the obvious tactical question. If this mysterious person escaped through the east terrace window, they would have had to climb down from the second floor. That suggests someone with considerable physical capability and familiarity with the manor's layout. Lady Ashworth nodded slowly. The library windows do open onto the east terrace, but it's quite a drop to the ground below. Not impossible for someone reasonably athletic, but certainly not something one would attempt unless they were quite desperate to avoid detection. Or, Poirot added thoughtfully, unless they were someone who had planned this escape route in advance and knew exactly what they were undertaking. Inspector Davies decided that a systematic search of the manor and its immediate grounds was now essential. As the police personnel began their expanded search, Poirot found himself drawn back to the library fireplace, where Lord Pemberton's body had been carefully photographed and prepared for removal. The positioning of the body was precise. Lord Pemberton lay on his back with his arms at his sides, his magnificent costume arranged with what seemed like deliberate care. It was not the chaotic sprawl that might be expected from a sudden violent attack, but rather something that suggested the victim had been carefully positioned after death. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "has the coroner provided any initial assessment of the time and manner of death?" Davies consulted his notes. Preliminary examination suggests death occurred between 11:30 and 12:15, which aligns with our timeline. The weapon was a thin, sharp blade inserted between the ribs with considerable precision. The coroner noted that either the perpetrator was very skilled or very fortunate. A few inches in any direction, and the wound might not have been fatal. And Lord Pemberton would have died quickly. Almost immediately, according to the preliminary assessment, he would have had no opportunity to call for help or defend himself. This information confirmed Poirot's growing suspicion that the murder had been planned with considerable care and executed by someone with either medical knowledge or previous experience with violence. The precision of the wound, the careful positioning of the body, and the mysterious note that had lured the victim to the library all suggested premeditation rather than a crime of passion or opportunity. But if the murder had been planned, why had the perpetrator remained in the library after committing their crime? Why risk discovery by Mrs. Henley when they could have escaped immediately? Unless, of course, there had been something else they needed to do, some additional task that required them to remain at the scene despite the obvious danger. Lady Margaret approached Poirot as he stood contemplating the crime scene, a silver and sapphire mask now dangling from her wrist by its silk ribbon. Without the elaborate disguise, her face showed the intelligent curiosity of someone who'd been following the investigation's developments with considerable interest. "Mr. Poirot," she said quietly, positioning herself so their conversation would not be overheard by the others, "I've been thinking about something that might be significant." "Please, madame, share your thoughts." "Earlier this evening, before Lord Pemberton's death, I observed what appeared to be a brief but intense conversation between him and young Mr. Whitmore. They were standing near the conservatory doors, and while I could not hear what was being said, their body language suggested some form of disagreement or confrontation." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed? And what was your impression of the nature of this disagreement?" "Lord Pemberton appeared to be, how shall I put it, delivering some form of ultimatum or warning. Mr. Whitmore's reaction was one of obvious distress, even fear." When their conversation ended, Lord Pemberton walked away with what I can only describe as grim satisfaction, while young Whitmore remained by the doors, visibly shaken. This observation added another significant element to the investigation's puzzle. If Lord Pemberton had been involved in some form of confrontation or conflict earlier in the evening, it suggested that his death might not have been random after all, but rather the culmination of tensions that had been building throughout the social gathering. "Have you shared this observation with Inspector Davies?" Poirot asked. Lady Margaret shook her head. "I wanted to speak with you first. Your reputation for discretion and insight is well known, and I felt you might be better positioned to determine whether this information is truly significant or merely the sort of social friction that occurs at any gathering." Before Poirot could respond, their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the main staircase. One of the constables conducting the search had apparently made a discovery, and his urgent summons brought Inspector Davies and several other officers hurrying toward the upper floors of the manor. The discovery, when revealed, proved to be both significant and puzzling. In one of the guest bedrooms that had been prepared for visitors who might choose to stay overnight, the searchers had found a dark cloak hidden beneath the bed. The garment matched exactly Mrs. Henley's description of what the mysterious figure in the library had been wearing, but the bedroom where the cloak was found belonged to none of the guests who had remained at the manor. According to Lady Ashworth's careful records, it had been assigned to a couple who had sent their regrets at the last moment, claiming illness in the family. The room should have been empty and undisturbed throughout the evening. Inspector Davies examined the cloak with professional thoroughness, noting its quality and construction, as well as any potential evidence it might contain. The fabric was of excellent quality, the sort of garment that would be expensive to purchase, and distinctive enough to be remembered by anyone who had seen it. More importantly, caught in the fabric near the hood were several strands of hair, dark, long, and clearly from a woman. "This changes things considerably," Davies murmured to Poirot as they examined the evidence. "If Mrs. Henley's account is accurate, this cloak was worn by Lord Pemberton's murderer. The hair suggests we're looking for a woman, which narrows our list of suspects significantly." Poirot nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than satisfied. "Indeed, Inspector, but we must be careful not to draw conclusions too quickly. Hair can be transferred from one person to another quite easily, particularly in social situations where people are in close proximity. These strands may belong to the murderer, or they may have been acquired innocently through earlier contact." The search of the manor continued, but no additional significant evidence was discovered. However, the systematic examination of the grounds did reveal more details about the mysterious escape route that had been used. The footprints leading from the east terrace to the old carriage path showed signs of haste, deeper impressions suggesting someone running rather than walking, and at several points, disturbed gravel indicating stumbles or missteps that would be consistent with someone fleeing in darkness across unfamiliar terrain. More intriguingly, the searchers found evidence that someone had been waiting in the gardens for a considerable period before the murder occurred. Beneath one of the large oak trees that bordered the east lawn, they discovered cigarette stubs and the impression in the grass of someone who had been sitting or crouching for an extended time, positioned where they would have had a clear view of both the manor's entrance and the ballroom windows. "This suggests premeditation on a level we hadn't previously considered," Inspector Davies observed, as he examined this new evidence. Someone was watching the manor, timing their approach, perhaps waiting for specific conditions before entering the house. But who among the evening's guests could have had such detailed knowledge of the manor's layout and routines? Lady Ashworth's social circle was relatively small and exclusive, composed primarily of families who had known each other for years. The idea that one of them had been planning Lord Pemberton's murder seemed almost inconceivable, yet the evidence was pointing increasingly towards someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim and the location. As the evening wore on and the investigation continued, fatigue began to show among the remaining guests. The shock of murder had given way to the exhausting strain of prolonged questioning and suspicion. Lady Ashworth had arranged for refreshments to be served in the morning room, but the elegant silver service and delicate sandwiches seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances. Young Whitmore had grown increasingly agitated as the investigation progressed, his earlier nervous energy evolving into something approaching panic. He paced restlessly around the morning room, his hands running constantly through his hair, his eyes darting between the other guests and the doorway as if calculating escape routes. "I don't understand why we're all being held here," he said suddenly, his voice high with strain. "If someone escaped through the gardens, surely the police should be searching for them rather than interrogating innocent guests." Sir Reginald regarded him with the steady gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating men under stress. "Calm yourself, Whitmore. The authorities are following proper procedure. Until they can determine exactly what transpired tonight, it's reasonable that we should all remain available for questioning." But Lady Margaret had been watching Whitmore with growing interest, and something in his behaviour seemed to have captured her attention in ways that went beyond mere concern for a fellow guest's emotional state. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "you seem particularly anxious about the investigation's progress. Is there something specific that's troubling you beyond the natural shock we're all experiencing?" He turned toward her with something approaching desperation in his eyes. "Troubling me? Good God, Lady Margaret, we're all suspects in a murder investigation. Is that not sufficient reason for anxiety?" "Of course," she replied calmly, "but your distress seems somewhat disproportionate to the circumstances, almost as if you have some particular reason to fear the investigation's findings." The accusation was delivered so smoothly with such perfect social polish that its impact was not immediately obvious, but Poirot noticed that Whitmore had gone very pale, and his hands had begun to shake visibly. "I have no idea what you're implying," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lady Margaret smiled. the expression somehow managing to be both sympathetic and predatory. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply observing that your behaviour this evening has been rather unusual." The tension in the room had ratcheted up several degrees, with Mrs. Henley and Sir Reginald both watching the exchange with growing alarm. Even Lady Ashworth had looked up from her untouched tea, her face reflecting concern about where this confrontation might lead. Poirot decided it was time to intervene before the situation escalated beyond control. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we're all allowing the strain of this tragic evening to affect our judgment. It is natural that everyone should be distressed under such circumstances." But Lady Margaret was not to be deterred so easily. "Mr. Poirot, with respect, I believe the strain of the evening may be revealing rather than creating the tensions we're observing. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us people's true natures." She turned back to Whitmore, her gaze steady and calculating. "For instance, I find it curious that you were so quick to suggest the murderer had fled when you yourself were observed moving toward the main staircase around the time of Lord Pemberton's death." That's not what I was doing." Whitmore's voice cracked with the strain. I needed some air. The ballroom was quite warm, and I thought a few moments on the terrace might—" "The main staircase doesn't lead to any terrace, Mr. Whitmore," Lady Margaret observed with deadly calm. "It leads to the upper floors of the manor, to the guest bedrooms, for instance, including the one where that dark cloak was discovered hidden beneath the bed." The silence that followed this observation was profound and uncomfortable. Whitmore stood frozen in the centre of the room, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and something that might have been resignation. Around him, the other guests watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a social catastrophe unfold. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. None of you understand what really happened tonight." Inspector Davies, who had been consulting with his sergeant in the hallway, chose that moment to return to the morning room. He took in the scene immediately, the charged atmosphere, the circle of guests focused on the clearly distressed young man, the sense of crisis that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "Is there something I should know about?" he asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of professional experience. Lady Margaret turned toward him with obvious satisfaction. "I believe, Inspector, that Mr. Whitmore has something important to tell you about the events of this evening." All eyes turned to Whitmore, who stood swaying slightly as if the weight of attention was physically oppressive. His earlier attempts at maintaining composure had completely evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked much younger than his years and infinitely more vulnerable. I didn't kill Lord Pemberton," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "But I was there, in the library. I saw what happened." Inspector Davies moved closer, his notebook appearing in his hands with practised efficiency. "Please continue, Mr. Whitmore. Tell us exactly what you witnessed." Whitmore sank into one of the morning room's elegant chairs, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had reached the end of their emotional resources. "Lord Pemberton had discovered something about my family's financial situation," he began slowly. "Something that could have ruined us socially and financially if it became public knowledge. Earlier this evening he approached me and made it clear that he intended to expose the information unless I met certain conditions." "What sort of conditions?" Davies asked gently. "Marriage," Whitmore said bitterly. "He wanted me to propose to his niece, Miss Catherine Pemberton, said it would be an advantageous match for both families and that my compliance would ensure his discretion about our financial difficulties. The revelation cast Lord Pemberton's character in an entirely new light. The respected socialite had apparently been using his knowledge of others' secrets to manipulate their personal lives, a form of social blackmail that was both cruel and effective within their insular world." "And you agreed to these conditions?" Inspector Davies continued. "What choice did I have?" Whitmore's voice cracked with emotion. "My father's business ventures had failed, though we'd managed to keep it secret. If Lord Pemberton had revealed our true financial situation, we would have been ruined. Not just financially, but socially. We would have been outcasts." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "I told him I needed time to consider his proposal, but he was insistent that I give him an answer tonight. He said if I didn't agree by midnight, he would begin spreading word of our family's circumstances tomorrow. So you went to the library to meet him? Yes, but not to agree to his demands, Whitmore said, his voice growing stronger with the relief of finally telling the truth. I had decided to call his bluff. I thought perhaps I could reason with him, appeal to whatever decency he might possess. And what did you find when you arrived? Whitmore's face grew pale again as he relived the memory. The library was dimly lit, just the fire and a few candles. At first I thought it was empty. Then I heard a sound from near the fireplace, a sort of rustling, like silk moving against silk. Inspector Davies leaned forward slightly. Go on. I called out Lord Pemberton's name, thinking he might be seated in one of the chairs where I couldn't see him. But instead of his voice, I heard footsteps moving quickly across the room. Someone in a dark cloak was moving toward the windows. The same cloaked figure that Mrs. Henley described? I believe so. They moved with such purpose, such urgency. When they reached the window, they climbed through without hesitation, as if they had planned exactly how to make their escape. And Lord Pemberton? Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I found him on the carpet by the fireplace. At first I thought he might have fainted or suffered some sort of attack, but when I knelt beside him, he shuddered. There was so much blood, and his eyes. They were open, but there was no life in them. The room had grown completely silent as Whitmore told his story, each word falling into the expectant quiet like stones into a deep well. Even the fire seemed to have reduced its crackling to a respectful murmur, as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. "What did you do then?" Inspector Davies asked softly. "I panicked," Whitmore admitted. "I knew how it would look. Me, alone with Lord Pemberton's body, after he had been threatening to ruin my family. Who would believe that I hadn't killed him? I thought about calling for help immediately, but I was terrified of what people would think." "So you left the library?" "Yes, but not before. Not before I noticed the paper in his hand. I could see that it contained writing, and I was afraid it might be some sort of note about our conversation, something that would implicate me in his death. I tried to take it, but Mrs. Henley entered the room before you could remove it." Whitmore nodded miserably. "I heard her footsteps in the hallway and barely had time to move away from the body. I hid behind the heavy curtains near the windows, hoping she would simply glance into the room and leave. But she came all the way in, and when she saw Lord Pemberton, you heard her scream and realised you needed to appear as if you were coming from elsewhere in the house. Yes, I slipped out through the same window the cloaked figure had used, made my way around to the front entrance, and came back into the ballroom as if I had been outside taking air on the front terrace." Inspector Davies made careful notes throughout this account, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. When Whitmore finished speaking, the silence stretched on for several long moments, while everyone processed the implications of his story. Lady Margaret was the first to speak, her voice thoughtful but not unsympathetic. "Mr. Whitmore, your account explains your presence in the library and your suspicious behaviour afterward, but it doesn't identify Lord Pemberton's actual murderer." "I know," he replied wretchedly. "I wish I could tell you more about the person I saw fleeing, but they were completely concealed by that dark cloak. I couldn't even be certain whether they were male or female." Poirot had been listening to Whitmore's confession with the intense concentration he brought to all significant testimonies. Now he leaned forward slightly, his bright eyes fixed on the young man's face. "Mr. Whitmore," he said gently, "you mentioned that you heard a rustling sound when you first entered the library, like silk moving against silk. Can you describe this sound more precisely?" Whitmore frowned, clearly trying to recall the exact details of what had been a traumatic experience. "It was soft, but distinctive, the sort of sound a woman's dress might make when she moves quickly, or perhaps—" He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "Actually, now that I think about it, it might have been the sound of someone searching through papers or documents. There was a quality to it that suggested rustling through items rather than simply moving about the room. This observation was potentially significant. If the cloaked figure had been searching for something specific, it suggested that Lord Pemberton's murder had been committed for reasons beyond simple personal animosity." Perhaps the killer had been looking for documents, evidence, or information that Lord Pemberton possessed. Was there anything else unusual about the scene when you discovered it? Poirot continued. Any detail, however small, that struck you as odd or out of place? Whitmore considered this carefully. The positioning of Lord Pemberton's body seemed deliberate, not the way someone would fall if they were attacked unexpectedly. His arms were at his sides, his costume arranged almost formally, and he hesitated, as if uncertain whether his observation was worth sharing. Please, Poirot encouraged. Any detail might prove important. There was a scent in the room, Whitmore said slowly. Something floral, but with an underlying medicinal quality. It wasn't Lady Ashworth's usual perfume, and it didn't match the natural fragrance of the flowers that had been arranged for the evening. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. The scent Whitmore described was remarkably similar to what he had detected on the mysterious mask found earlier. Jasmine mixed with something medicinal. The connection suggested that the same person who had worn that mask had been present in the library at the time of the murder. Mrs. Henley, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout Whitmore's confession, suddenly stood up from her chair with obvious distress. "I can't bear this any longer," she exclaimed. "All this speculation and suspicion. We're tearing each other apart when the real murderer has escaped into the night." Her outburst seemed to come from genuine emotional distress, but Poirot noticed that it also had the effect of redirecting attention away from the specific details of Whitmore's account. He wondered if this was intentional, or merely the result of overwhelmed nerves. Sir Reginald moved to steady Mrs. Henley, his military training making him naturally protective of someone in distress. "Mrs. Henley, please calm yourself. I understand this is all very trying, but we must allow the investigation to proceed." "But don't you see?" she continued, her voice rising. "Every moment we spend here questioning each other is a moment that allows the real killer to get further away. They could be miles from here by now." Inspector Davies looked up from his notes with professional calm. "Mrs. Henley, I appreciate your concern, but proper investigative procedure requires that we thoroughly examine all possibilities. Mr. Whitmore's account has provided valuable new information, but we still need to determine the identity of the person he saw fleeing the scene." Lady Ashworth, who had remained largely silent during Whitmore's confession, now spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing complex social situations. "Inspector Davies, I've been thinking about the logistics of this evening's events. If someone was indeed waiting in the gardens before the murder, as your search suggests, they would have needed considerable knowledge of the manor's layout and routines. Please elaborate, Lady Ashworth." "The east terrace is not visible from the main approach to the manor," she explained. "Someone positioned in the gardens would have needed to know not only which window provided access to the library, but also the timing of the evening's events. They would have had to understand when the library might be unoccupied, when Lord Pemberton might be expected to arrive, and how to escape without being observed by servants or other guests." This was an astute observation that significantly narrowed the field of potential suspects. The kind of detailed knowledge Lady Ashworth described was not something that could be acquired casually. It suggested someone with intimate familiarity with both the manor and the social patterns of its occupants. Poirot nodded approvingly. "Exactly so, Lady Ashworth. We are not dealing with a random intruder or a crime of opportunity. This was planned by someone with considerable insider knowledge. But that would suggest—" Mrs. Henley began, then stopped abruptly, as if realizing the implications of what she was about to say. "Yes," Inspector Davies prompted gently. "That would suggest the murderer was someone who knew the house well," she finished reluctantly. "Someone who had been here before, who understood the layout and the routines." The implications of this conclusion were uncomfortable for everyone present. If the murder had been committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the manor, the list of potential suspects was limited to Lady Ashworth's closest circle of friends and regular visitors. Lady Margaret had been following this reasoning with obvious interest, her sharp intelligence engaged by the logical progression of the investigation. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of uncomfortable truth. "I believe, Inspector Davies, that we must face the possibility that Lord Pemberton was murdered by someone in this room. The statement fell into the morning room's atmosphere like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and denial that spread through the assembled guests. Sir Reginald straightened to his full military bearing, his face reflecting indignation at the suggestion. Mrs. Henley gasped audibly and pressed her hand to her throat. Even Lady Ashworth, with all her social poise, could not entirely conceal her reaction to such a direct accusation. "Lady Margaret," Sir Reginald said stiffly, "I must protest such unfounded speculation. To suggest that one of Lady Ashworth's guests could be capable of murder is both inappropriate and insulting." But Lady Margaret was not to be deterred by social conventions. "Sir Reginald, I understand your reluctance to consider such possibilities, but we must be guided by logic rather than social comfort. The evidence clearly indicates that this crime was committed by someone with detailed knowledge of the manor and its occupants." Young Whitmore, who had seemed somewhat relieved after finally telling his story, now appeared stricken by this new development. "But surely," he said desperately, "there must be other explanations. Perhaps someone who had worked here previously, or a business associate of Lady Ashworth's who had visited frequently." Inspector Davies consulted his notes thoughtfully. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore raises a reasonable point. Lady Ashworth, could you provide us with a list of people who have had regular access to the manor over the past year? Servants, tradespeople, business associates, frequent social visitors?" Lady Ashworth nodded, though her expression suggested the task would be both extensive and painful. "Of course, Inspector. Though I must say that the circle of people with the kind of intimate knowledge we're discussing is quite limited. The manor's staff has been stable for years, and my social circle, while active, is not particularly large." As Lady Ashworth began to compile the requested list, Poirot found himself returning to the physical evidence that had been discovered throughout the evening. The mysterious mask, the dark cloak, the carefully positioned body, the note written in Lady Ashworth's handwriting. Each piece of evidence told part of the story, but the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Something that had been nagging at his subconscious suddenly crystallized into a clear thought. The note found in Lord Pemberton's hand had been written in Lady Ashworth's handwriting, asking him to meet in the library at midnight regarding something about CA. But Lady Ashworth had claimed she was prevented from keeping the appointment by an emergency in the kitchens. "Lady Ashworth," Poirot said suddenly, "you mentioned that you were called away from your appointment with Lord Pemberton by an incident in the kitchens. Can you provide more specific details about this emergency?" She looked up from her list-making, her expression puzzled. "Yes, one of the serving girls, Mary, I believe, had suffered a minor accident. She had dropped a tray of glassware and cut herself on the broken pieces. As hostess, I felt it was my responsibility to ensure she received proper medical attention." "And this occurred just before midnight?" "Yes, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes before the appointed time. I was quite frustrated by the timing, as I had been hoping to resolve Lord Pemberton's concerns quickly and return to my guests." Inspector Davies looked up with interest. "Is this Mary still available to confirm your account?" I'm not certain," Lady Ashworth replied, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "After ensuring she was properly cared for, I believe she may have been sent home for the evening. The cut was not serious, but she was quite shaken by the accident." Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Davies. It would be important to verify Lady Ashworth's alibi by speaking with this serving girl, but if she had indeed been sent home, it might prove difficult to confirm the details of the story immediately. "Lady Ashworth," Poirot continued gently, "during your time in the kitchens dealing with this emergency, did anyone else witness your presence there? Other servants, perhaps, who could confirm the timing of the incident?" Her face grew slightly pale. The kitchen staff was quite busy with the evening service, and everyone was focused on their own responsibilities. I cannot be certain who might have noticed my presence specifically." This lack of corroborating witnesses for Lady Ashworth's alibi was concerning, particularly given that the mysterious note had been written in her handwriting. The possibility that she had been involved in Lord Pemberton's murder was one that none of them had seriously considered, but the evidence was beginning to point in uncomfortable directions. Mrs. Henley, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the evening progressed, suddenly stood up with obvious distress. I simply cannot bear any more of this speculation and accusation, she declared. We are all friends here, people who have known each other for years. The idea that one of us could be a murderer is absolutely preposterous. Her emotional outburst was understandable, but Poirot noticed that it came at a moment when the investigation was focusing on potentially uncomfortable truths about Lady Ashworth's alibi. He wondered if the timing was coincidental, or if Mrs. Henley was deliberately attempting to disrupt a line of inquiry that might prove embarrassing to their hostess. Lady Margaret, ever observant, had also noted the timing of Mrs. Henley's interruption. "Mrs. Henley," she said calmly, "I understand that these suggestions are distressing, but surely you agree that the truth must be uncovered, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be." "The truth!" Mrs. Henley's voice rose to nearly a shout. "The truth is that a madman broke into this house and killed poor Lord Pemberton. The truth is that while we sit here accusing each other, the real killer is escaping justice." Sir Reginald moved to comfort her again, but she shook off his assistance with unusual force. Her behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic, and Poirot began to wonder if her emotional distress was entirely what it appeared to be, or if there were other factors at play. It was at this moment that Inspector Davies received an urgent message from one of his constables. After reading it quickly, his expression grew grim, and he looked up at the assembled company with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he announced. "Our search of the surrounding area has uncovered evidence of a violent struggle near the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the estate. We found blood on the ground and signs that someone may have been seriously injured." The reaction to this news was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Henley went completely white and swayed as if she might faint. Lady Ashworth gasped and reached out to steady herself against a nearby table. Even Sir Reginald's military composure seemed shaken by this development. "Inspector," Lady Margaret asked with admirable calm, "do you believe this discovery is related to Lord Pemberton's murder?" "It's too early to say definitively," Davies replied carefully, "but the timing and location suggest a possible connection. We're conducting a thorough examination of the scene now." Young Whitmore, who had been relatively calm since making his confession, now appeared stricken by this new development. You don't think the person I saw fleeing the library might have..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "We must consider all possibilities," Inspector Davies said diplomatically. "However, I should mention that we also found something else near the cottage that may be significant." He paused, looking around at the assembled guests with the careful attention of someone trained to read human reactions under stress. "We found a woman's evening glove," he continued, "embroidered with initials that may help us identify its owner." The silence that followed this announcement was profound and heavy with unspoken implications. Every woman present instinctively looked at her own gloves, checking to ensure both were still in place. Poirot watched these reactions carefully, noting who seemed genuinely surprised by the news and who appeared to be calculating the potential significance of the discovery. Mrs. Henley's reaction was perhaps the most dramatic. Her hands flew to her throat, and she made a small choking sound as if she were having difficulty breathing. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. What were the initials on the glove?" Inspector Davies consulted his notes with deliberate care. "D.H., he said quietly. The effect of these letters on Mrs. Henley was immediate and devastating. She collapsed into her chair as if her legs would no longer support her, her face draining of all colour. Her hands shook visibly as she raised them to cover her face, and when she spoke, her voice was muffled by her fingers. "It's mine," she whispered. "The glove is mine." The admission fell into the room's atmosphere like a thunderclap, reverberating through the silence with explosive force. Every eye turned toward Mrs. Henley, who sat hunched in her chair like someone who had been physically struck. Inspector Davies approached her with professional gentleness, his notebook ready but his manner unthreatening. "Mrs. Henley, can you explain how your glove came to be at the gamekeeper's cottage?" She looked up at him with eyes that were bright with tears and something that might have been relief. I suppose there's no point in pretending any more," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I haven't been entirely truthful about what I observed tonight." "Please," Inspector Davies encouraged, "tell us what really happened." Mrs. Henley took a shuddering breath before beginning her revised account. When I entered the library and saw the cloaked figure kneeling beside Lord Pemberton's body, I recognised something about them. Something familiar in the way they moved, the set of their shoulders. You knew who it was? I believed I did, though I couldn't be certain with the cloak concealing their features. When they fled through the window, I made a decision that I now realise was both foolish and dangerous. She paused, gathering her courage before continuing. Instead of calling for help immediately, I followed them. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the assembled guests. The idea that Mrs. Henley had pursued a suspected murderer into the darkness seemed both incredibly brave and remarkably foolhardy. I climbed through the same window and followed the sound of their footsteps across the grounds, she continued. They were moving quickly, but not silently. I could hear them stumbling occasionally in the darkness, clearly unfamiliar with the terrain despite their apparent knowledge of the house's interior. And you followed them all the way to the gamekeeper's cottage? Yes, though I was careful to maintain my distance. I was terrified of what they might do if they realised they were being pursued. When they reached the cottage, they seemed to pause, as if trying to decide whether to take shelter there or continue fleeing. What happened then? Mrs. Henley's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I tried to get closer so I could see their faces when they removed the cloak. I was certain that if I could identify them, it would help the investigation enormously. But I misjudged the distance and stepped on a fallen branch. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. She shuddered at the memory before continuing. They spun around immediately and saw me. For a moment we just stared at each other across the clearing. Then they began moving toward me, and I realised I might be in terrible danger. Did you recognise who it was? The cloak's hood was still up, and the moonlight was too dim to make out features clearly. But something about their posture, their movements, seemed familiar. I was almost certain I knew who it was, but before I could be sure... She trailed off, her hands working nervously in her lap. What happened next, Mrs. Henley? Inspector Davies prompted gently. They lunged toward me, and I turned to run. In my panic, I stumbled and fell, losing one of my gloves in the process. I scrambled to my feet and ran back toward the manor as quickly as I could, expecting at any moment to feel hands grabbing me from behind. But they didn't pursue you. No, thank God. When I looked back from the edge of the formal gardens, I could see a figure moving away from the cottage in the opposite direction, toward the old carriage path that leads to the main road. Inspector Davies made careful notes throughout this account, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. When Mrs. Henley finished speaking, he looked up with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern. Mrs. Henley, you've described an extremely dangerous situation. Why didn't you report this encounter immediately when you returned to the manor? She looked around the room with obvious embarrassment. Because I realised how it would sound. I had already discovered a murder victim and failed to report seeing someone else at the scene. Then I had pursued a suspected killer into the darkness and lost a piece of evidence in the process. I was terrified that no one would believe my story, that I would be suspected of involvement in Lord Pemberton's death. It was a human reaction, understandable if not particularly helpful to the investigation. But Poirot sensed there might be more to Mrs. Henley's reluctance than simple fear of suspicion. Her behaviour throughout the evening had suggested someone operating under considerable emotional strain, and her delayed revelations felt less like recovered memory than like carefully calculated decisions about what information to reveal and when. Mrs. Henley, he said gently, you mentioned that the cloaked figure seemed familiar to you, that you believed you might recognise them despite their disguise. Can you be more specific about this impression? She hesitated, her eyes moving around the room to take in each of the assembled guests. It's difficult to explain precisely. It was more a matter of physical presence than visual identification, the way they carried themselves, their general build and bearing. And this suggested a specific person to you? I thought it might have been... She stopped, shaking her head. No, I can't be certain. The lighting was too poor, and my own fear may have affected my perceptions. It would be wrong of me to accuse someone based on such uncertain impressions. But Poirot had caught something in her expression, a flicker of recognition or knowledge that she was struggling to suppress. He suspected that Mrs. Henley's reluctance to identify her suspicions was based on more than mere uncertainty. It suggested someone whose identity would be particularly shocking or painful to reveal. The investigation had now revealed a complex sequence of events surrounding Lord Pemberton's murder. According to the various accounts, the library had been visited by at least 3 people around the time of the murder. Lord Pemberton himself, the mysterious cloaked figure who had apparently committed the crime, and young Whitmore who had arrived to find the aftermath. Mrs. Henley had then entered to discover the body and had subsequently pursued the fleeing killer to the gamekeeper's cottage. But significant questions remained unanswered. Who was the cloaked figure that both Whitmore and Mrs. Henley had observed? Why had they remained in the library after committing the murder, apparently searching through papers or documents? And what had prompted them to kill Lord Pemberton in the first place? Lady Margaret had been following these developments with the sharp attention of someone trained to analyse complex social and political situations. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful logical analysis. "Inspector Davies," she said thoughtfully, "it occurs to me that we may be overlooking an important aspect of this case. We've been focusing on the identity of Lord Pemberton's killer, but we haven't adequately examined his motives for the confrontations and manipulations that apparently preceded his death. Please elaborate, Lady Margaret." Lord Pemberton was apparently using his knowledge of others' secrets to manipulate their behaviour, pressuring Mr. Whitmore into an unwanted engagement, and according to the mysterious note, preparing to reveal something about CA that would presumably be damaging. This suggests a pattern of behaviour that may have created multiple enemies. Inspector Davies nodded approvingly. "You raise an excellent point. If Lord Pemberton was in the habit of using social blackmail to achieve his goals, he may have made more enemies than we initially realised." Poirot had been thinking along similar lines, and Lady Margaret's observation crystallised thoughts that had been forming in his mind throughout the investigation. "Indeed," he said, "we must consider the possibility that Lord Pemberton's murder was not the result of a single conflict, but rather the culmination of a pattern of behaviour that had created considerable resentment among multiple people." Lady Ashworth, who had been largely silent during the recent revelations, now spoke with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid I must tell you something that may be relevant to your investigation, though it pains me greatly to speak ill of the dead." All attention turned toward their hostess, who had maintained her composure throughout the evening's traumatic events, but now showed signs of considerable internal struggle. "Lord Pemberton did indeed approach me several weeks ago with information about my late husband's business dealings," she began slowly. "He claimed to have discovered evidence of financial irregularities that could damage my family's reputation if they became public knowledge." "What sort of irregularities?" Inspector Davies asked gently. "Nothing criminal, I assure you, but certain creative accounting practices that were employed during difficult financial periods. My husband was not a businessman by nature, and some of his advisors took advantage of his trusting nature to implement strategies that, while legal, might appear questionable to outside observers." She paused, collecting herself before continuing. "Lord Pemberton suggested that his discretion could be ensured through certain considerations, specifically his appointment to the board of directors of my husband's remaining business interests, along with a consulting fee that struck me as quite generous." The picture of Lord Pemberton that was emerging through these revelations was far from flattering. Rather than the respected socialite he appeared to be publicly, he seemed to have been operating as a sophisticated blackmailer, using his social connections and insider knowledge to manipulate others for personal gain. "Did you agree to his demands?" Inspector Davies continued. "I felt I had little choice," Lady Ashworth replied with obvious distress. "The potential scandal would have affected not just myself, but also the employees of my husband's businesses and the various charitable organisations we support. I agreed to consider his proposal, with the understanding that we would finalise the details after tonight's ball. And the note found in Lord Pemberton's hand, the one asking him to meet you in the library at midnight to discuss something about CA, that was indeed written by you?" "Yes, though the circumstances were somewhat different from what I initially indicated. I wrote the note not to discuss his concerns about my husband's business practices, but to inform him that I had decided to reject his demands entirely. This revelation cast Lady Ashworth's movements during the crucial period around midnight in an entirely new light. If she had intended to confront Lord Pemberton and refuse his blackmail demands, she would have had a strong motive for ensuring their conversation remained private and uninterrupted. "Lady Ashworth," Poirot said carefully, "when you say you were called away by an emergency in the kitchens, preventing you from keeping your appointment with Lord Pemberton, can you provide more specific details about the nature of this emergency?" Her face grew pale, and for several long moments she seemed unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. There was no emergency in the kitchens," she admitted. "I fabricated that story because I was afraid of how the truth would appear." The admission sent another wave of shock through the assembled guests. If Lady Ashworth had lied about her alibi for the crucial time period, it suggested that her involvement in Lord Pemberton's murder might be far more direct than anyone had previously considered. "Please tell us what actually happened," Inspector Davies said, his voice carrying the calm authority of professional experience. Lady Ashworth stood and walked to the morning room's tall windows, looking out into the darkness as if seeking strength from the familiar grounds of her estate. When she turned back to face the room, her expression carried the dignity of someone who had decided to face difficult truths directly. "I did go to the library at midnight as planned," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional strain. "Lord Pemberton was already there, waiting by the fireplace. He seemed pleased to see me, as if he assumed my presence meant I had decided to accept his terms." "What happened during your conversation?" "I told him that I had decided to reject his demands entirely, that I would rather face whatever scandal he might create than submit to his manipulation. I explained that I had consulted with my solicitors and that they had advised me that his threats might constitute criminal extortion." She paused, her hands clasped tightly together. Lord Pemberton's reaction was explosive. He became extremely angry, more so than I had ever seen him. He began making threats that went far beyond mere social embarrassment. He spoke of destroying not just my reputation, but my ability to maintain my charitable works, my business interests, even my position in society. "How did you respond to these threats?" I remained as calm as I could and reiterated that I would not be intimidated. I told him that if he chose to make public whatever information he possessed, I would deal with the consequences as they arose. Then I turned to leave the library. "But you didn't leave?" Lady Ashworth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. As I reached the door, Lord Pemberton said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said that if I thought I was the only person whose secrets he possessed, I was gravely mistaken. He began to speak about other people in this room tonight, and the information he had gathered about their private affairs. The implication was clear and devastating. Lord Pemberton had apparently been operating a comprehensive system of social blackmail, gathering damaging information about multiple members of their social circle, and using it to manipulate their behaviour for his own benefit. "What did he reveal about the others?" Inspector Davies asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer would be both significant and uncomfortable. He spoke about financial difficulties, family scandals, romantic indiscretions, a catalogue of secrets that could destroy lives and reputations if they became public knowledge. Some of the information was about people who had been my friends for decades, people I cared about deeply. Lady Ashworth's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the act of finally telling the truth was giving her courage. I realised that Lord Pemberton's death would mean freedom not just for myself, but for everyone he had been manipulating, that the world would be better without his particular brand of cruelty. The silence that followed this statement was profound and uncomfortable. Everyone in the room understood the implication of what Lady Ashworth was saying, that she had committed murder not just for her own benefit, but as an act of liberation for an entire social circle. "Lady Ashworth," Inspector Davies said quietly, "are you confessing to the murder of Lord Pemberton?" She looked around the room one final time, her gaze taking in each of the friends who had been unknowingly threatened by Lord Pemberton's machinations. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet dignity of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. "Yes," she said simply, "I killed Lord Pemberton." The confession fell into the morning room's atmosphere with the finality of a judge's gavel. Mrs. Henley gasped audibly and pressed her hand to her throat. Sir Reginald straightened to his full military bearing, his face reflecting a complex mixture of shock and something that might have been respected. Young Whitmore sank deeper into his chair, as if the weight of revelation was physically oppressive. But it was Lady Margaret's reaction that Poirot found most interesting. Rather than shock or horror, her expression showed what appeared to be satisfaction, as if a complex puzzle had finally been solved to her intellectual satisfaction. "How did you do it?" Inspector Davies asked, his professional training allowing him to focus on practical details despite the emotional impact of the confession. "I had brought a letter opener with me to the library," Lady Ashworth continued, her voice steady now that the truth was finally being told. "Initially it was meant only as a precaution. I was unsure of how Lord Pemberton might react to my refusal of his demands, but when he began describing the other secrets he possessed, the lives he was prepared to destroy for his own amusement." She paused, her gaze distant as she relived those crucial moments. Something inside me simply broke. The thought of him continuing to manipulate and torment people I cared about became unbearable. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I had struck. "And then you positioned the body?" "Yes. It seemed important that he should look peaceful. Despite everything he had done, he had once been a friend. I couldn't leave him sprawled carelessly on the carpet like a discarded thing." Inspector Davies made careful notes, his expression reflecting the complex emotions that such confessions always provoked in experienced investigators. "And the dark cloak that was found hidden in the guest bedroom? I had worn it over my evening gown to ensure that if anyone saw me entering or leaving the library, they would not immediately recognize me. After Lord Pemberton was dead, I realized I needed to dispose of it quickly. The guest bedroom seemed like a safe hiding place until I could remove it from the manor entirely." "But you were seen fleeing through the window by both Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Henley." Lady Ashworth nodded slowly. "I heard footsteps approaching the library just as I finished arranging Lord Pemberton's body. There wasn't time to leave through the door without being seen, so I used the window as an escape route. I had played in these gardens as a child and knew exactly how to climb down from the library terrace safely. And Mrs. Henley followed you to the gamekeeper's cottage. I was aware that someone was pursuing me, though I couldn't be certain of their identity in the darkness. When I reached the cottage, I intended to hide there until I was sure it was safe to return to the manor. But I heard footsteps approaching and realised I had been followed." She turned to look directly at Mrs. Henley, her expression filled with regret. "I am deeply sorry that you were put in such danger. When I saw you there in the moonlight, I was terrified that you had recognised me and would expose what I had done. For a moment I considered, but I could never have harmed you, Dorothy. You have been too dear a friend for too many years." Mrs. Henley's eyes filled with tears at this revelation. "I knew," she whispered. "Deep in my heart I knew it was you, but I couldn't bring myself to believe that you could be capable of such an act." "I pray that someday you might forgive me," Lady Ashworth replied gently. "Not for Lord Pemberton's death. I accept full responsibility for that decision, but for putting you through such an ordeal tonight." Young Whitmore, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious distress, suddenly spoke up. "Lady Ashworth, you said that Lord Pemberton possessed damaging information about others. Does that mean, are the rest of us now safe from his threats?" She smiled sadly. "Yes, James. Whatever secrets Lord Pemberton had gathered died with him tonight. The documents he showed me are locked in his private safe, and without him to reveal their contents, they can harm no one." The relief on Whitmore's face was visible and immediate. The financial ruin that had threatened his family was no longer a concern, and the forced engagement that Lord Pemberton had demanded was no longer necessary. But this freedom had come at the cost of Lady Ashworth's own liberty and possibly her life. Sir Reginald, who had maintained his military bearing throughout the evening's revelations, now stepped forward with obvious difficulty. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want you to know that while I cannot condone what you have done, I understand why you felt compelled to do it. Lord Pemberton's behaviour was unconscionable. "Thank you, Reginald," she replied with genuine warmth. "Your friendship has meant more to me than you could know, particularly during these difficult months since my husband's death." Inspector Davies had been making detailed notes throughout Lady Ashworth's confession, but now he looked up with the expression of someone who had reached the most difficult part of his professional duties. "Lady Ashworth, I must inform you that you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Pemberton. I am required to advise you of your rights and to arrange for your transport to the county jail pending formal charges." She nodded with calm dignity. "I understand, Inspector. I have been expecting this moment since I made the decision to take Lord Pemberton's life. I am prepared to face whatever consequences the law demands." As Inspector Davies began the formal procedures of arrest, Poirot found himself reflecting on the complex moral questions that the evening's events had raised. Lady Ashworth had committed murder, a crime that society could not and should not condone. Yet her motives had been rooted in a desire to protect others from a systematic pattern of cruelty and manipulation that might have continued indefinitely if left unchecked. The assembled guests watched in respectful silence as Lady Ashworth was led away, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. She paused at the morning room door to address them one final time. "I want you all to know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room, "that I do not regret my decision. Lord Pemberton's death has freed not just yourselves, but countless others who might have fallen victim to his manipulations in years to come. If I must pay the ultimate price for that freedom, I consider it a fair exchange." With those words, she followed Inspector Davies from the room, leaving behind a group of friends who would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the complex legacy of her final act of protection. As dawn broke over the countryside, painting the sky in rose and gold, the mystery had been solved. Lady Ashworth was led away with dignity, her confession bringing resolution and sorrow to all who witnessed the night's events. The guests departed for their homes, each carrying knowledge that their freedom had been purchased at a terrible price. The great house stood silent, its elegant rooms bearing witness to a night that had transformed lives forever. Poirot gathered his coat and hat, preparing to leave. The masquerade was over, truth emerging from behind elaborate disguises. But like all truths revealed through tragedy, it carried bitter knowledge that some problems could only be solved through actions that wounded as deeply as they healed. In the countryside where tradition and honour meant everything, justice had been served through sacrifice of one who chose to bear judgment's burden, so others might be free. The wind whispered through ancient oaks, carrying autumn's scent and promise of seasons yet to come. The masquerade ball would be remembered not as celebration, but as a night when masks came off to reveal true faces beneath, faces marked by courage and sacrifice, by the eternal struggle between self-interest and love that defines humanity. As Poirot's carriage rolled down the tree-lined drive, he carried Lady Ashworth's final words, spoken with quiet dignity, facing certain doom. In them he heard echoes of all who had chosen others' welfare over personal safety, his heart heavy knowing such choices would continue as long as humans walked the earth. The mystery was solved, but lessons would endure, whispered like autumn wind through leaves, carrying eternal truths about love, sacrifice, and prices we pay for freedom of those we hold dear. So let these whispered tales carry you gently towards sleep, dear listener, where all stories find their truest home and mysteries their perfect resolution. In dreams, may you find peace that eluded some tonight, and wisdom to choose well when your own moments of decision arrive. The masquerade is ended, masks removed, and truth triumphant, though not without cost. Rest now knowing justice, though sometimes delayed, finds its way, and love, though tested by tragedy, endures beyond all earthly trials. Good night, gentle listeners, and may your dreams be filled with mysteries as intriguing as tonight's tale, but with endings far more gentle and kind. As tonight's tale fades into silence, we wonder, where in the world are you listening? From the glowing nights of Dubai, the quiet canals of Venice, the windswept streets of Dublin, or the still shores of Auckland? If these stories speak to your soul, like, share, and subscribe. Until our next journey through the dark, rest gently and let your dreams wander far.